Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support of House Concurrent Resolution 319, commemorating the one-year anniversary of the terrible shooting at Fort Hood, Texas. On November 5, 2009, a gunman entered the Soldiers Readiness Processing Center at Fort Hood, Texas, and mercilessly opened fire on military and civilian personnel who were preparing for deployment or who had recently returned from being overseas in a deployment. 13 people were killed in this attack, including 12 soldiers, one of whom was an expecting mother, and one former soldier. 31 people were wounded. Some of the wounded, like Staff Sergeant Patrick Ziegler, have required months of care and rehabilitation, and that is an ongoing situation. There are wonderful stories that come out of this. One story that I heard, as a young soldier saw his sergeant get shot the third time, he jumped between his sergeant and the shooter and took the rest of the rounds into his body because he just was afraid his sergeant wouldn't be able to survive anymore. At the time, there was a graduation ceremony going on at Fort Hood from college, and a bunch of young soldiers were graduating from college right next door. When the call went out for medics, multiple members of that group threw off their cap and gown before they graduated and took off next door to the processing center to work with the wounded. Without regard to their own safety, civilian and military law enforcement personnel, including Sergeant Munley and Todd, acted swiftly and courageously to neutralize the threat using the active shooter training program they had recently completed. Army medics immediately reverted to their combat home training and began treating the wounded and saved a lot of loss, or more loss of life. Fellow soldiers from everywhere descended upon this area, and while the shooting was going on, risked their lives to evacuate their brethren safely to Darnell Army Hospital and to that safety. Fort Hood regional communities, the state of Texas, the military service organizations, and countless Americans united in support of Fort Hood victims and their families, collecting millions of dollars in charitable donations. My office has worked hard to ensure that the Fort Hood victims to which they are entitled as combat victims. Additionally, we are working with the Department of Defense to overcome regulatory obstacles that have prevented the victims and their families from receiving charitable donations. I am hopeful our Senate colleagues will agree to these legislative adjustments included in this year's Defense Authorization Bill to ensure that Fort Hood victims and their families receive every benefit to which they are rightly entitled. I want to thank the House Armed Services Committee and the House leadership for working with my office to swiftly bring about this resolution to the floor. And I ask my colleagues to join me in honoring the Fort Hood victims and their families by passing this House Concurrent Resolution 319. Mr. Speaker, I intentionally did not discuss the accused shooter in an effort to protect his rights to a fair and impartial trial when that trial occurs. And I thank